Hello, my name is Amy Yi, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I'll be sitting down with Scott Anthony to discuss his latest book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate: How to Make Creativity an Everyday Habit Inside Your Organization. I'm excited to be here with Scott Anthony. Scott is a senior partner at InSite, where he helps leaders design new growth strategies, build innovation capabilities, navigate disruptive innovation, and manage strategic transformation. Scott has so far written 8 books, including the most recently Eat, Sleep, Innovate, and Dual Transformation from 2017, which describe how forward-thinking organizations can navigate disruptive change and own the future. Scott is a prolific contributor to Harvard Business Publishing. He is the most published digital author on HBR.org and is Harvard Business Corporate Learning's most in-demand subject matter expert. He has been based in Singapore since 2010, where he served as a member of the Committee on the Future Economy and a board member of Media Corp from 2013 to 2019. Last year, he was named one of the world's top 10 influential management thinkers by Thinkers 50, and in 2017, he won the T50 Innovation Award. In his latest book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate, Scott and his team of co-authors use groundbreaking research in behavioral science to provide a first-of-its-kind playbook for empowering individuals and teams to be their most curious and creative every single day. So James Quincy, the chairman and CEO of the Coca-Cola Company, has read this book and highly recommends it. He said this dynamic read offers tangible exercises and principles to create an environment that fosters innovation to deliver extraordinary results. Eat, Sleep, Innovate expertly blends creative insights with intriguing case studies. If you want to make innovation a natural and habitual act with your team and organization, you need to read Eat, Sleep, Innovate. Scott, I'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for joining me today to discuss your new book. Um, so first, I'd like to start with the background of this book. So can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you and your team to write this book, and how did you put it together?
Well, thank you very much, Amy. It is a pleasure to be with you on this podcast. So it's really exciting to share some of the thoughts in the book. It started about 5 years ago. We had a meeting with a client. It was the CEO of a great big global shipping logistics company. And we were talking about the things that we talk about. And we were saying disruptive change, you need to have a separate part of your organization that's thinking about it, blah, 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 blah. He said, yep, I've done that. I've got that. I've read all of your other books. I understand that. He said, my real question is, what do I do with the 28,000 other people I have in my organization? And I said, that's a really good question. So I tried to put together an answer to that question and put together a manuscript back in 2015, but we just weren't ready to really give a good answer to it. So I kind of put it on the shelf. Then a couple years after that, Paul Cobbin, who is a co-author of the book and the chief data and transformation officer at DBS Bank, asked me the kind of question that's kept me in consulting for almost 20 years. And that is a question that I didn't exactly know how to answer. And his question was, could you purposefully shape a culture? Could you purposefully design a culture? So we did about a year-long project with Paul and his team. The answer to the question was yes, and we had the missing piece to design the book. So we took the great work that we did in that DBS Bank case, along with things that my colleagues at InSite had done in a number of other places, some publicly available research case studies, some fresh case studies. We blended it all together, and in October 2020, out came Eat, Sleep, Innovate. And of course, it always sounds cleaner when you describe it than in reality. There's twists and turns and times where it's not held together and all that. But that's the basic journey to create the book.
Thank you so much, Scott. And apparently you put a lot of efforts into this. And I think your hard work has really paid off. This is such an interesting read and practical guide for anyone, I think, who's looking to sort of create a culture and of innovation in their own organizations. And also, like at Catbull, a lot of people know him. He is the co-founder of the Pixar Animation Studio and also the co-author of the very famous book Creativity. He has also read your book and said, if you want to unleash more creativity in your organization, you can't simply tell people what you want. Rather, you need to create a culture that emboldens them to behave like innovators. And you need to trust that this is what they want to do. And if your goal is to promote new ways of thinking, Eat, Sleep, Innovate is an indispensable guide. So I think Ed brought up a really good concept, which is a culture of innovation. And I've heard this phrase in many occasions, and it seems to be defined differently in different situations. So in your book, how do you define a culture of innovation? And also from your experience, as you mentioned, of working with many different organizations across the world, what are some of the benefits have you seen of creating such a culture of innovation within organizations?
It's a great couple of questions, Amy. So let me start with the definition because the definitions are really important and it is a step that people often skip. Culture is a use that is, I'm sorry, culture is a word that is used vaguely. Innovation is a word that is ill-defined. You put them together and it's almost like you're speaking mush. So let me give you the definition that we use in the book. We define a culture of innovation as one in which the behaviors that drive innovation success come naturally. That's what a culture of innovation is. Now, you have to unpack that a little bit. You also have to define innovation. We define innovation simply as something different that creates value. Something is vague to remind us it's not just technology. We have different rather than breakthrough because some forms of innovations are breakthroughs like hypersonic planes or life-saving vaccines, but some things can be day-to-day improvements and that's fine too. And creates value reminds us that innovation goes beyond invention and creativity. As Thomas Edison once said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're not sweating, you're not innovating. So then the last thing to build on the definition of innovation are those behaviors. In the book, we list out 5 specific behaviors. We list out curiosity, customer obsessed, collaborative, being adept in ambiguity, and empowered, and argue that in environments where those behaviors come naturally, where they're habits, where you don't have to force people to do them, you don't have to give them massive incentives to do them. They do them because that's the way that people do things in the organization. That's what a culture of innovation is. In terms of the benefits, there's a lot of research into the benefits of some of those individual behaviors. There's famous research that Google did that showed that psychologically safe teams that can be adept in ambiguity outperform their revenue targets by about 20%. There's broad research that shows the benefits of being successful at innovation. There have been a number of studies that show highly innovative companies get a 3 to 4% boost in total shareholder returns over peers that are not. But I don't think you even really need to look at the numbers. You just kind of do the thought experiment. Imagine a world in which people could be curious and they could be creative and they could try things and they could be empowered. I think it is self evident that that is a better world than the world that exists in far too many organizations. And therefore, I think every organization should be advancing towards creating a culture of innovation.
Thank you so much, Scott. And this really resonated with me as well. Last year, the conference board did a study on what makes a great and highly engaged team, and innovation and ideas is definitely one of the critical elements of building such a engaged team. So definitely, as you talk about, a lot of organizations are striving to create and sustain such a culture of innovation. Have you seen any challenges that organizations have faced in this process? And how can organization overcome this challenge? Do you have some examples to provide?
Yeah, so there's a lot of challenges, obviously, and this is another germ that's been with me that helped to lead to this book. So over the last 15 years, in addition to providing advice to organizations all around the world on growth and innovation, I, along with my wife, have raised 4 children. Our children are almost 15, 12, 9, and 4. And one of the big puzzles for me is that I don't have to tell my children to follow the behaviors that drive innovation success because they're kids and kids are naturally curious and they're naturally collaborative and they naturally like to try new things. But something happens to kids as they grow up, and it gets worse when they go inside organizations. It's almost like that latent innovation energy gets constrained and contained. And it goes back a little bit to Ed Catmull's quote that you have to believe that that is what people want. A lot of people think that they have to provide incentives or other sorts of things to drive innovation in their organization. But in many cases, it starts with a foundational belief. That is, the people in your organization are capable of doing fantastic, innovative things. If you can release the shackles, unharness them, and amplify that latent innovation energy. Put in simple terms, innovation is something different that creates value. Organizations exist to do what they are currently doing better, faster, or cheaper. That means the biggest enemy to innovation inside organizations is the organization itself. It is a set of systems and structures and policies and procedures, all of which mutually reinforce to do what they're currently doing better, all of which stand in the way of doing something different that creates value. I mentioned before Paul Cobbin, one of the co authors of the book, along with Andy Parker and Natalie Pinchot, two of my colleagues. DBS is a great example of how a large established organization can create a culture of innovation. 10 years ago, DBS lagged in its local market. Today, it recently won for the third year in a row the Best Bank in the World award, something that's never been done by a bank in Asia. And the driver of that has been a cultural transformation where DBS today functions not like a stodgy regulated bank, but like a 28,000 person startup. It is a remarkable story.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. I really like what you said that the biggest enemy of innovation is the organization itself. And thank you for providing such a fantastic example about how DBS created a culture of innovation. With that, we are going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue this conversation with Scott Anthony on his latest book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our conversation with Scott Anthony on his latest book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate, How to Make Creativity an Everyday Habit Inside Your Organization. Scott, in your book, you mentioned that organizational culture change requires a movement that goes beyond a lone net. It requires followers by behavioral enablers, artifacts, and nudges, and you call them beans, BEAN. I really love it. So throughout the book, you also provide with readers with over 100 beans that you collected from workplaces across the globe. So in your mind, what makes a bean successful? And do you have a few favorite beans you'd like to share with our listeners today?
Absolutely, and don't worry, Amy. I will not share all 101. I'll just share a couple beans that really speak to me. But this really is the core addition that the book brings to the very ample literature about culture change. Because there's a lot of things that we know we have to do. Leaders have to role model new behaviors, and we need to have great communication and all that. And we try as best we can to amplify those points in the book. But we think this idea of a bean is a legitimately new idea. And the basic idea is, remember, a culture of innovation is one in which the behaviors that drive innovation success come naturally. The biggest barrier is institutionalized inertia. You're caught in a rut, you're in an existing habit. So, what we do with the bean concept is we borrow from the habit change literature and we apply it to an organizational construct. So, at a basic level, a bean makes sure that you tap into the two systems that Daniel Kahneman and other behavioral psychologists have described as the different ways in which humans make decisions. There is a logical part of your brain that needs a behavior enabler that's got checklists and guides. And there is a part of your brain that makes very quick decisions, that needs something that nudges it in forms of having visible objects or designing the way an office is set up. So you do things without even thinking about that. To get a little bit more specific, a good bean needs to be simple. It needs to be something that's practical, that you don't have to really train people to go and do. It needs to be something that's reinforced because habit change is hard. It needs to be organizationally consistent. You can't tell people to do one thing and give them incentives to do something else. It needs to be unique and memorable so people have it front of mind. And it needs to be something that you can track, measure, and improve. We have given another acronym in that forms, if you listen to all the words there, that forms the acronym SPROUT. So you need to have beans that sprout, and that is as cute as we get in the book. In terms of favorite beans, I'm going to give two of my favorite beans here. The first one comes from DBS, which we talked about before. So a few years ago, DBS identified something that was inhibiting its ability to function as a startup at scale. It said that it needed to adopt agile practices. And as a part of that, it needed to have really collaborative meetings. But its meetings were anything but. They would start late, they would end later. Many people were digitally distracted, there were no clear outcomes, and so on. So DBS introduced the Mojo bean. Mo stands for meeting owner. The meeting owner makes sure the meeting starts on time, ends on time, that there are clear outcomes, and there's equal share of voice. The Joe is the joyful observer. They're appointed by the Mo. They watch the Mo and give visible feedback at the end. If they see that people are digitally distracted in the room or over Zoom, they can call for a timeout and tell people to put down their devices to make sure that they're present and active in the meeting. When the meeting ends, everybody has the opportunity to give feedback to the Mo through a simple app. The Mo then gets a report about how well they're doing living up to their job as the meeting owner. This is a great combination of behavior enablers that provide step by step help and some of those artifacts and nudges that are invisible ways to direct people to follow new behaviors, and it works. Before the Mojo Bean, about 40% of people said that meetings were collaborative. Today, that number is about 90%. And DBS has saved about 500,000 employee hours because meetings are not just more effective, they're also more efficient. The second bean I'll go through much more quickly. This is from the Finnish gaming company Supercell. Supercell has a really cool ritual. They have people who are working on games all the time. Sometimes those games succeed. They get out into the iTunes store, they get out into the Google Play store. They have a ritual where everyone gathers and they crack open a beer. That's not the bean that I really like. Every once in a while, a game that people are working on doesn't work. They decide midway through that they're going to stop the effort. It is a failure. They have a ritual. Everyone gets together and they pop open a bottle of champagne. They say cheers to failure. The champagne bottle has a blank label on it where they can write in what they learned from the failure. Think about the power of this ritual. It shows people that it is okay to push the envelope, to try to do things. And if you fail, it's not going to be something that will punish you and follow you along. They say cheers to failure and encourages people to continue to innovate and grow. And as mentioned, there are 99 other ones in the book. I won't go through the rest of them, but things like this that really help to encourage the behaviors that drive innovation success.
Great example. Thank you so much, Scott. And I love the Mojo being. I think how to run effective meetings is a problem that many people are struggling with. And it's such a simple technique, but it makes a huge impact to the organization and employees. So I will highly recommend other people to also adopt this technique. So, so Scott, you mentioned that the beans that other organizations have used. So what about your own company, InnoSite? What are some beans that your company uses to drive innovative behaviors and also foster a culture of innovation? Do you have a few examples to share?
And I really want to focus on one because it's multifaceted. I think it does a good job of showing the bean concept again. And this is something that we call InSite Different. And of course, before we came up with the bean concept, we didn't have language to describe this. We actually started it well before we had the bean concept, but it fits nicely. So this idea traces back to 8 or 9 years ago. At the end of every year, we talk to a bunch of our consulting clients to get feedback on the work that was done and feedback on the people who are working with them. And remember distinctly, there was just this steady thing that we heard from clients. And that was we asked them, why did you hire Innosight? There's lots of other consulting companies out there. They're great. Why did you hire us? And what we expected them to say was, you've got great intellectual property. We were co-founded by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. So we thought it was going to be tools and frameworks. But that's not what anybody said. They said, yeah, you've got tools, but everybody has tools. What makes InSite different, they said, is just who your people are and the way that they show up. So we realized our competitive edge came from our culture, which is embodied in the key values we have in the organization: intellectual curiosity, humility, collaboration, inclusivity, initiative, and so on. So we said we need to make sure that these values really are at the core of everything that we do. So we created a bean that has a few different pieces in it. At the end of every year, we give out awards to people who do the best job living up to those values, and dozens of people get nominated for them. We also make sure that the values hang on the walls of our offices so that that can serve as as an invisible nudge to remind people of their importance. We have the values on screens in offices as well, tied to stories of work that we've done with some of our consulting clients. We put them inside our recruiting decks, inside our pitch decks, as ways to continue to reinforce how critical these values are. And we have regular employee pulse surveys where we ask people, how good a job are leaders doing in living up to these values, as a way to make sure that we have data to continue to nudge that kind of behavior. By having this combination of awards and artifacts on the wall and measurable data and the stories that spread from people who go and follow the values, we can continue to reinforce them and make sure we live up to the promise of being InSite Different.
That's really good point, Scott, that people are the great asset of the organization. And it's really important to reinforce such values by like including artifacts and sharing stories with other organizations and your clients. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit. Um, as we all know that 2020 is different. So the COVID-19 global pandemic has forced organizations of all different sizes and industries to adapt, evolve, and also transform. We've been over 6 months into this, but the future is still filled with a lot of uncertainty. So how can organizations cultivate a culture of innovation in such an environment where there's a lot of ambiguity, uncertainty, and change? Do you have some suggestions to offer for organizations?
Absolutely. And this is, of course, a very critical issue that many organizations are dealing with today. Now, I'll turn back for just a minute to a book that I wrote in 2009 when the world was in the midst of its last global crisis, the global financial crisis. I called that book The Silver Lining. And I called the book The Silver Lining for two reasons. The first is that history speaks very clearly. Anytime you look at a crisis, you look at a recession, you look at a geopolitical shock, you look at a pandemic, and so on. There's a lot of bad things that happen, of course, but there also are significant opportunities for innovation and growth, no matter how dark the times. In 2007, 8, 9, more than 100 unicorns were born, many of which drew or echoed off some of the things in the global financial crisis. You had companies like Adobe and Lego that made bold moves and separated themselves from the competitors. And you're going to see the exact same thing now. The other reason I called that book The Silver Lining is the resource constraints that get placed on organizations when they're in tough times force them to follow behaviors that actually accelerate innovation. You have to be more focused in your innovation efforts. You have to be smarter at how you run experiments. You have to share with other people to make sure that you're not carrying the load on your own, embracing open innovation and other things. These are all things that people should be doing already. A crisis forces them to do it. So the silver lining is the opportunities are there, and some of the behaviors that it forces are actually good innovation behaviors. Now, specific to the COVID 19 pandemic, the biggest thing that is unique here is the digital dislocation. The fact that most people are working remotely, people are not physically gathering, and so on. This is a real opportunity for people to think, how do we encourage collaboration? How do we encourage community in ways or in worlds in which we can't physically interact? And I've seen organizations do all sorts of interesting things. For example, I had a lunch meeting that was organized by a government agency in Singapore, all done remotely, but the government agency ordered food to arrive at everybody's house at the same time. So it felt like a communal activity. You can also think if you're trying to have an event, how do you create physicality around it by sending something to people's homes? You can think about the benefit that you get from digital dislocation. While there are certain downsides, there are some real benefits when you have the democratization effect of everybody square on the screen being the same size, which can, if you manage it in the right way, lead to more inclusive discussions. So I think a lot of this, Amy, comes down to the mindset. If you recognize that there is a silver lining behind any crisis, if you think about what are small ways, even drawing on the bean concept perhaps, to try to encourage a little bit more of that physicality when we're digitally apart, and if you find ways to embrace and lean into some of the benefits, it can take the crisis and begin to turn it into more of an opportunity.
Good insight. Thank you so much, Scott. I agree that this is a great opportunity for organizations to rethink and also redefine how work gets done. And I'm sure that organizations that you talk about, the mindset organizations that are undergoing the business transformation or are exploring ways to pivot their organizations will find this suggestion really helpful. So, Scott, is there anything that we haven't covered today, but you'd like readers to know as well?
I just want to come back and reinforce the point that we talked about before that was kind of embodied in Ed Catmull's quote about the book, that you have to believe that they want to do this. And just tell a story about a really pivotal moment in DBS's development. So a few years ago, DBS went out to visit Netflix just to try and learn from it and its very widely admired culture. And someone from DBS on the engineering side began to complain. This all sounds nice, Netflix, but you've got it easy. You just hire these kids straight out of schools in Silicon Valley, and we just don't have the human capital that you have. The person at Netflix said something that really changed history. The person asked, our average engineer is about 40 years old. How old is your average engineer? DBS said, actually, about the same age. The person at Netflix then said, you know what? Many of the engineers we hire come from banks just like yours. We just get out of their way. The idea is the innovators are there. When I think about my four children, I think about a belief that's turned into a conviction. The world's greatest untapped source of energy, I believe, isn't in the wind, it isn't in the water, it isn't in the sun. It's inside our established organizations that are filled with people that once were curious Charlies, hopeful Hollies, happy Harrys, thoughtful Teddies. Those are my four kids, by the way. My job as a parent is to make sure the kids never lose their love of learning. My job as an advisor to large organizations around the world is to help them capture, harness, and amplify the innovation energy that lies within. It is a tough time in the world right now, but we need to do this so that we can collectively innovate, not to the new normal, that is depressing, not to the new abnormal, that's even worse, but so that we can innovate to the new better. It is within our grasp if we think and act in the right way.
Very well said, and really make everyone to ponder. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Scott. I've learned so much from you today, from you and your book. So I'd like to end today's conversation with a more personal question. And Scott, you talk about your kids. So we also think that the travel often gives us inspirations for work and life and also ideas for innovation. At the beginning of the book, you mentioned that you and your family visited Cambodia a few years ago and were inspired by some local organizations. So once the pandemic starts to ease more and more travel restrictions get lifted, where would you go? Where would you bring your family and your kids?
There are so many places, Amy, and it's one of been the great joys of living out in Asia for the past decade, getting to see so many beautiful places. And there's so many places that the kids want to go. I think the one that would be number one on their list is going to be the one that is hardest to get to. They're all quite desperate to go to New Zealand, which we have never gone to before. New Zealand, for better or worse, has said it's not really accepting visitors until 2022. So maybe we'll go for something simpler and say it's been a long time since my kids have seen their cousins, most of whom live in the United States. So I think a visit home might be in order.
It's very nice, and I hope that we all can travel without restrictions very soon. Thanks again for your time today, Scott. Really appreciated that, and I'm already looking forward to reading your next book. I would also like to thank our listeners today, and if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series, or even explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at www.conference-board.org/podcasts. Thank you for listening today. Bye-bye.